All right, well, welcome to See, Hear, Love Summer Strength Series. Jason Persaud, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad that you're with me today.
Thanks, Melinda. It's an honor, and I'm excited to be here with you.
Yeah, well, as just before we hit record on the podcast, it was so funny how, I was telling you how I kind of like got you and chose you to be on the show and and how we have mutual friends, but we've never really connected. Like sat and said, "Hey, Jason, hi, how's it going?" So this is really neat. I love that when it happens this way, where I've heard your name, I've seen you around, but we've never, I think, formally and officially connected and met each other. So I think this is it. I guess this is our moment.
I think so. It's so cool because I think we've been friends on social media probably for a couple years and have,
Yes,
followed each other in some way and have, like you said, all the mutual friends. But now to come and meet like this is even more awesome. So great.
I know. It's great. So, Jason, I want to just get going on, our conversation because I'm really interested and I think it will be really beneficial and will strengthen those who are church leaders, church pastors, people in ministry, because we're really focusing today on the church and all the thoughts about that. But I think I just want to ask you first off, how are you doing? So after 2 years of the pandemic, and here you are a pastor. How are you feeling? How are you doing? What's happening in your life?
Yeah. I think like many other pastors, Melinda, the last 2 years has been very challenging on a number of different levels. Family, ministry, personal, and even the sense of transition of just what is going on, and even to some degree, some anxiety about just when you hear about other friends in ministry being like
Hmm.
resigning or losing their ministry roles as a result of finances, all these things begin to plague in your mind. And I'm in a little bit of a fortunate situation because our church has really weathered the pandemic with some stability, financially, team wise. We have a great team. And then, obviously, my wife is also a pastor on staff as well. So in the beginning, it was like, what are we going to
Wow.
do if we both are
Yeah.
told that, the church can't accommodate? And so our pastor and our board really took a step of faith and said, hey, we're not going to allow any of the staff to leave. We're going to keep you on. We're going to trust God. And actually, the church
Mm,
increased their missions giving because we knew that there were many other places that were hurting more than us. But dealing with the people
fantastic.
issues, I think, was the biggest challenge, Melinda. A lot of
Mm,
people were under the weight of the stress and anxiety of what was happening, and that created very long days, even though we weren't in the office. Dealing with the people issues, I think, was a significant weight that we were carrying, that, to be honest with you, was
mm,
quite draining. And now here we are,
mm.
getting out of the
Yeah.
pandemic, and we haven't seen, people come back in the droves like we were, post-pan or pre-pandemic.
Hmm.
And I'm doing okay personally. I think
Okay.
having a great pastoral team that really linked arms to stand with each other is valuable. And we're more of a mid to medium sized church. We had just
Mm,
averaging close to 600, and a good sized team with good relationships really helped us weather the storm. And I think today I'm in a decent place. I actually went back to school over the pandemic as well to get my
oh
master's,
wow.
so I'm just on the tail end of finishing that.
Fantastic.
But we're doing pretty good.
Hmm. It's good. Jason, what would you say? I ask this to a lot of my guests. What would you say that you've learned about yourself and God through the pandemic? You had sort of 2 years, and you say it was draining, but it's great to hear that the church linked arms and you were strong through it. But what would you say personally, a lesson that you've learned
I
through the
think one of
past
the
2 years?
biggest, yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I learned as a pastor, uh, I would say in the beginning, I struggled with my identity, to be quite honest with you. You get so wrapped up and involved doing
Mm-hmm.
ministry, you don't realize that your identity gets very intertwined into what you do. And I would say the first 6 months for me were
Yes.
really a time of reflection of just like, why am I in ministry? And I have to be honest with you, Melinda, the first 6 months, I felt like God was doing this deep work in me, and I realized that there were areas of brokenness in my life that I hadn't dealt
Mm,
with. There was, like emotional and mental things. Because in ministry, as
mm-hmm,
there's things coming at you at all, from all ends, and there's not time to recover from the disappointment and the hurt that you experience in ministry. You just go, 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 take the hits, and I'm a visionary. I'm a go-getter. It's hard for me to slow down, and I'm very thankful that it actually happened on one end because it caused us to slow down as the church. And it
mm-hmm,
brought me to one point where, as much as I was doing good on another end, I was having to deal with unresolved things that I think were piling up as a result of just the rigor of ministry, that God was saying, okay, I'm going to put my finger on this and we're going to deal with this, because when we get out of this,
mm,
if you still have this, you're going to have a problem.
yeah. Wow. You said a lot there. I think I agree. I I know for many people, I mean, it was tough. I mean, we'll say that it was tough. There was so much grief and loss and lament, and it was hard. People were isolated. And I have friends now, Jason, who are still struggling with their mental health because of
Hmm.
this. But I would agree with you. I am a go-getter. I'm a doer. I produce and I go and I make things happen. And this made me really slow down and really, for the first time, kind of forced pause to say, it's a break. Are you just doing work for me, Melinda? Like God saying, are you just doing work for me? Because you haven't been with me. So you're
Yeah,
doing all the work for me, but you're not actually choosing to be with me. So there's a
yeah,
problem there, right?
absolutely.
Like, God, I'm doing it all for you. And they're like, yeah, you're doing all this work for me, but you're actually totally missing me. Like, you're missing all the moments with me, being with me.
Yeah,
And so that actually came really clear, you know?
yeah. Do you
That kind
know?
of scares me a little bit, especially when you are in ministry and you're like, but that's what I'm supposed to do. And
That's
then you hear
true.
God go, no, actually, you're supposed to be with me instead of doing everything for me, in that way. And that was big.
Yeah, no,
That was really big.
I absolutely agree with you, but I can remember, Melinda, it was like the first month that we were in the pandemic where I really felt God just got a hold of me and put his finger on something. I was working out in our basement and trying to scramble like everyone else that loves going to the gym. I'm a gym rat, love staying in shape. And I was working out and I was just scrolling through social media on Instagram through stories, and someone had posted this group called Maverick City Music. I don't know if anyone's heard about them. Now they're huge. And I
Yeah.
remember going to on
Yeah.
Spotify and listening to one of their songs called Refiner's Fire. And it was really about God refining our heart. And as I listened to this song, I just began to weep. I literally had to stop working out. And I was just on the floor, on my
Wow.
knees, just weeping. And here I am thinking, God, what are you doing in my life in this moment? And I realized that that was the
Mm,
beginning of God beginning to do something deep in me, but I had stopped, and we were in this place of, is the church reopening in the next week or two, or whatever it is, but God got my attention. And that beginning of that journey was, uh, I think, a life changer for me, just sitting here today feeling like I'm in a healthy spot. But it was good because
mm,
it started all these God moments here in my own home, in my basement, late at night when everyone was sleeping, my wife and
yeah.
my kids, and God just beginning to slow me down and just say, "Hey, I want to speak to you. I want to work in you. I want your identity. I want you to know that I love you for who you are and not for what you do." And I
Mm,
think for many of
you
us,
do.
we get in this mode of trying to please God and live up to God's expectations, because we try to live up to other people's
Mm,
expectations, that we try to measure
yes.
up. And God just says, "Hey, I just love you for where you're at, and I want to work in you. I want to have this deep communion and fellowship. And now that I've got your attention, here we go."
Good. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I say this, I'm obviously just I'm careful because I again, I do acknowledge that there was a lot of, pain during the pandemic, but I also really believe it, and I'm still processing this. I think there's gonna be a lot of books and papers coming out of the pandemic of what we learned. I mean, through, mental health challenges and things, but also what we learned. And yeah, I think for the first time, I mean, the full stop. So I couldn't distract myself with other things. I had to actually be home, or I
Yeah.
actually had to be with myself. I
Hmm.
couldn't run away from myself. I
Yeah.
could go off and do lots of fun things constantly so that I'm distracted. So that was really good. And I've said this in other interviews and on the show. I picked up some things like cooking, which I hated to do, and the ukulele, and all those kinds of fun things.
Great.
But I think for me, honestly, I think God was. I mean, God's always speaking, but I think I was listening a lot more closely because I was attuned more because I was quiet and there was space to do so. Uh, there was a lot of space to do so, and so I think you're right. I think that's beautiful to hear because I think for a lot of people, these past 2 years were really life changing, or
Yeah.
could have been life changing if we really listened and leaned into it. But I really felt that too. I felt that these past years really changed the way that I see people and things and God and community and all kinds of things. That now coming out, just processing little bit more and thinking
Hmm.
deeply and thoughtfully, right? Like there has been definitely a change and a shift, and so that's really awesome. Let's talk about the church a bit now that
Yeah.
we're in a healthier place.
Yeah.
um, oh, there's so much, Jason. Let's start with one of the things that my husband and I are, kind of in, and I've been feeling a little like, oh, my heart is hurting and breaking, is whether the pandemic exacerbated it or it's always been there, but it just kind of like came to the top. It's just a lot of, and I know we use this, and we've been saying this for years about the deconstruction of faith. And I think the struggle, it's just hard. I have friends and former and mentors who have completely left or
Hmm.
are in process of and deconstruct but are not deconstructing to go nowhere. It's really hard.
Yeah.
And you know there are days I don't know how to deal with it, speak to them, make sense of it, or have the words to encourage people who are really just like, I don't know if I believe this anymore. The church is the worst.
Yeah.
And I don't know if even God exists. And these are people who like were my mentors, were my pastors, were. So I feel that there's been great loss and lament, that I've experienced in that space. And I know that's a lot to say. Okay, Jason, tell me how to fix it, what to do. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about that because I'm in that process and still in that, just trying to navigate through all of that.
Melinda,
I know. I know.
it's a heavy topic, and I think for me it's heavy on a number of different levels. Number one, I've had friends in ministry recently that have experienced or are going through that and issues in the church or having to step down from ministry and but I've also been through it as well. A number of years ago, I was on
Mm,
staff at a church that, in my mind, was a financial scandal. That they were not
mm,
honest with the church, they were not honest with the staff, the board, and the lead pastor. And when we were locked out of our building as a result of a mortgage default in payment, I was the one that was tasked to call the entire church based on the information
wow.
that the board gave me, which means when the truth came out, who was going to take the fall? The person that communicated the information to the church. And so for me,
Mm,
when I spoke up about some of the issues or the inconsistencies in the story, my wife and I became targets of the church and experienced some deep pain and some deep hurt and a
mm,
lot of accusations thrown at us why we left over a number of reasons in order that they would cover themselves to not make themselves look back. And it's interesting because God had been orchestrating some things where the staff actually wasn't getting paid on a regular basis. Like we sometimes had to wait for tithes and offerings to come to
wow.
get paid. And my wife and I were both on staff, and I decided a number of months prior to step out of full time ministry but remain at the church as a layperson. And so it afforded us to be able to relocate and move. That's how bad it was. We relocated where my wife is from down in the Maritimes with when all the mess really hit the roof. And I
Mm-hmm.
actually didn't want to go back to church. I was in a deconstruction mode myself of
Mm-hmm.
serious depression, serious disillusionment, and even with the board and with the pastor, like we were friends. We were close. Like we spent time in their home on a weekly basis with their kids and with them. And the fact that things would get twisted and turned around. And so for me, when I look at everything happening in the church today, whether it's deconstruction, church scandals or accusations and all these things, for me it becomes very personal because I've known what it has been like to walk through false accusations with people that you
Mm-hmm.
trusted and you loved and you cared about, and keeping silent and asking God, how is this going to come to justice? And then I look at even what's happening today on a number of different levels, and I don't need to name the different churches that have made the news in North America over the last little while, but it causes so much pain and so much hurt. And I think one of the greatest lessons that I learned through my own situation, walking through that and losing many relationships, Melinda, there are people to this day
Mm-hmm.
that even though God has restored us in ministry and even given us a greater voice than what we have, would never believe our side of the story, but would only believe one side of the story. And so, I'm not saying this publicly on the podcast to make people or the church or the board to look bad. It's just a reality of
Mm-hmm.
what we walk through. But if I could say anything like this, when you're a victim of uh, working through deconstruction as a result of church hurt or church abuse or even spiritual abuse, I think what we're looking for is humility and honesty and transparency from those leaders.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, and and I think God brings us on this journey. And I got to be honest with you, I had said to my wife, I said, Carrie, I'm never ever going to go back into pastoral ministry ever again. Never again. And let me tell you the funny thing here, Melinda. When we relocated back to the Brampton area, for me to work with a large missions organization where we have many mutual friends of, uh, Youth for Christ, let me say that phenomenal
Mm-hmm.
organization. I was with them for 6 years, and that is really where I began to experience healing from church hurt and spiritual abuse. And I looked at it as, hey, I'm not in pastoral ministry. I'm in ministry doing what I love, reaching our community, touching people. And they were a significant part of my healing journey to actually get me back in ministry because I really felt, and I said this to the Lord many times, I can never bring change. I can never make a difference. And just speaking out of hurt, and as a way of getting back into pastoral ministry, where I've been for the past 6 years, I've recognized that I can bring change, that I can be a genuine and transparent and real leader. And I think sometimes that we try to protect the image of the church at the expense of people. And I think we need to look at the best interests of the people when they are hurt, apologize, repent, make things right, be humble, and do
Mm-hmm.
whatever we can to make things right in order to help people continue on their journey so that they
Mm-hmm.
don't deconstruct their faith. Because the reality is the church, from what I've talked to people that are deconstructing it, and I've been in ministry for over 20 years, a lot of it is tied to some of the scandals in the church, but mostly church hurt and church abuse that we have not been
Mm-hmm.
honest about. Just my thoughts.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Well, and I
Yeah.
think, Jason, that when we're talking, because that's my heart and yours about next generation, I mean, that's why millennial Gen Z are just like, I don't know, right? Because they're hearing the scandals, they're seeing the scandals, they're part of it. Um, they're seeing all the hurt, they're seeing what the church does to hurt people. And I think what you're saying is right on. I mean, if we're gonna get the next generation, like our kids are 15 and 18, and they're kind of like about church, right? I mean, and tons
Yeah.
of kids I know, and millennials. I think that humility and honesty and transparency is going to be the key.
Hmm.
Because
Absolutely.
I think they've seen too many of these sort of like celebrity pastors, and then the falls and the financial scandals in the church, and just character issues, and they're just like, I don't want to have anything to do with that,
Yeah.
right? And why would you? If I was
Yeah.
outside of the church, I wouldn't either. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, I sometimes put myself outside. I like to kick myself outside of ministry and church as someone who's like, I try to be completely objective and look at it. And there are times, Jason, I'm like, oh, I don't think I would do that either. I don't think I
Yeah.
would go that direction either. Like, and that's very honest. And so there is, I understand why people are where they're at. I think it's just hard when it's like you can't stay there forever though. Like if you're gonna deconstruct, you got to make the decision. I mean, I know process can be long, but
Hmm.
there are times where I'm just like, okay, you've been processing a long time now. There's got to be a decision made at some point. Like where are you? Who are you following? What are you going to do? And maybe some people are going to process till the end of their life. I don't know, but I think it is hard, Jason, sometimes just to hear it over and over and over again, and there's no decision made. Right?
Hmm.
It's like
Yeah.
the same things they say. But I absolutely agree. I think that's really, thank you for your honesty too, your honesty and your humility and transparency in that, because I'm sorry to hear that you went through that. And it's amazing that you're back in ministry after that.
It is a miracle that I'm back in ministry.
Well, I was
My
going to say
wife jumped,
miracle.
do you know something? My wife jumped back into pastoral ministry first. And, here when we moved back to Ontario, and I still had so many issues to work through. There was just so much distrust that I had in the institution of the church and in the leadership of the church. And
Hmm.
I have great pastors. Where we are today, I have
Yeah.
I have phenomenal pastors, but I didn't trust them. And it's not that they weren't good people or trustworthy people. When I looked at the institution of the church and I looked at the politics, and let's just be real, church has politics. We saw that in the book of Acts.
Hmm.
Acts had the deal, this is only a few years after Jesus
Yep.
ascended and he sent the church out on a mission. Politics was right involved, and we see that in Acts chapter 6. And so all these different things just were things that I had to work through and just process. And I think there's some things that only the Holy Spirit can do in our lives. And every
Mm.
day I had to make a decision to lean into the Lord. As hurt as I was, as frustrated, as disappointed, as cynical as I was. And I got to be honest with you, I wish Carey Nieuwhof had written his book, and talked about being cynical years before. I just read Carey's book
Hmm.
within the last couple years through the pandemic, and I thought, oh man, that book really could have helped me. But I just became so cynical towards the church because we have institutions in the marketplace that we don't trust. And now the place that I should trust, and I know the church is not
Hmm.
perfect. The church will never be perfect. Let me just say that to those that are listening. And for us to say, well, I just want to go to the perfect church. Well, you're not going to find a perfect church. The church in Corinth was imperfect, and this is within just 20 some odd years of, Jesus, leaving the earth. It was a hot mess. The church will never be perfect, as we say, because we're imperfect people, and we can't allow that for us to deconstruct God. I might deconstruct the institution of the church, the culture
Hmm.
of the church, the way the church does things, some of the things that the church preaches and teaches, but there has to be one unmistakable thing is that Jesus is who he said he is. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that was the thing that held me, Melinda, through my process of hurt and even deconstruction is that I knew that I had an encounter with Jesus when I was 16 years old. He changed my life when I got called into ministry in significant moments. And these are the moments that we need to hold on to as we process our deconstruction in whatever people call it, deconstruction phase. Is you go
Yeah.
back and look, has God been faithful in my life in this moment, in this moment, in this moment? And I
Hmm.
couldn't walk away from the pull of the Holy Spirit saying, do you remember this moment? Do you remember this moment? And that helped me stay at least with some kind of anchor as I was feeling like I was sinking at times in my faith journey through that mode of just being hurt, just knowing that I had encounter with God when I got saved, baptism, and just these significant moments that I don't have time to talk about today, but that helped me
Mhm.
just sort of navigate those moments. So my encouragement to anyone listening, look back at how faithful God has been in your life in significant moments. It might not be a
Mm.
hundred moments you could pick out, but are there two or three that you could say, yeah, this was a moment that I journaled, or I was at a church service, or I was listening to a speaker, or listening to a podcast or a worship song, and I know God touched my life there, and I had an encounter with Jesus.
That's good. Now, this next question might be a tough one or not, but I think the other challenge for people, and I absolutely agree. I think that's really well said, Jason, about deconstructing church. The institution, processes, all of that, and remembering God and who He has been and has worked out in your life. And I agree with that. That's really really good. But I am
Mhm.
also hearing from next generation, the challenge of church with racism
Mhm.
and gender issues.
Yeah.
As a young woman, a brown young woman with leadership and communication gifting, man, was it ever hard being in the church?
Yeah.
Because I can't change that I'm brown or a woman, but because of that, in my early experiences, I couldn't lead, I couldn't talk, I couldn't preach, I couldn't even serve communion, I couldn't even pass the offering plate, I could never be on the board. Now tell that to any young girl now,
Yeah.
and they'd be like, "Are you kidding me?" And there have been some people, some young women over the years who, can't believe I stayed
Yeah.
in it because they're like,
Yeah.
that's opposite of what you say for us as when you go to universities and colleges, Melinda, and you speak, when you go to high schools, you
Yeah.
know, when you go to youth groups, what God has given you in within His power through the Holy Spirit, go with the gifting. And when you had young girls who were completely gifted as preachers and teachers and leaders, but in the context, and I know this is a big theological conversation. I'm just
Yeah.
saying, I think we have to be very honest as leaders in the church about that because uh, it was interesting. My our daughter, maybe she was 13, and I'm surrounded by strong women. I have women around me who are CEOs of companies, who are, you know, TEDx speakers, who are leading. Like they are boss women all over. And she overheard me talking to somebody on the phone about either a situation, Jason, about how a woman can speak at the church,
Mhm.
okay, or something.
Yeah.
And afterwards, she's like, "Melinda, did I hear that? Like that? Like, wait a second. So you have your own show. You have a
Yeah.
big, huge platform on national TV. You literally speak about Jesus to thousands of people, and you're just talking to a girl that she couldn't speak or lead in a church." Right? Like, so you're looking at the context of a young girl who's surrounded by strong women who love Jesus. And outside of the church, we are leading and being light. And she heard that. And actually, I took a moment. I'm like, it's true. Like, I couldn't
Yeah.
lie to her. I said, yeah, there are still churches that, and again, wherever you're at, Jason, I don't know. But I think that's real. I think that's something that we have to have conversations about because you've got millennials and Gen Z who would not stand for that. In
Yeah.
that, just like, and racism. Like, so think about them Brown. It was like all these assumptions about me, and so I was blocked in all these areas because of gender and color,
Wow.
which I'm not changing. Like,
Yeah.
God made me. This is who I am, and I never apologized. But man, was it hard. And I'm
Wow.
glad I stuck with it. There are times, Jason, that I was a prodigal daughter and I ran away because I was like, for different reasons in my own identity and things like that. So, but there were moments where I'd sit there and go, wow, because of who I am, I can't do this. But yet I feel fully called and created and the gifting deposited in me for this, and yet I can't do it.
Wow.
Anyway, I'm throwing that out too because it's like because you are about reaching the next generation. I think these are really important conversations to have for church leaders because how do you
Mhm.
reconcile that when you've
Mhm.
got women and men and people of color who feel that they cannot because of this, and that is something that I I grieve. Like my heart hurts because of it.
Yeah.
And there's
Oh,
my rant.
wow.
On to you,
Yeah.
Jason. I know it's big. I'm just it's
Wow.
real. It's a conversation that needs to be had.
Absolutely,
I
Melinda.
know.
And, let me just say this. Thank you for continuing and doing what you're doing because your voice is reshaping the way that church needs to be reshaped in order to allow women in general to be involved, more involved in ministry, to preach and to teach and have influence more than they've ever had. And as a woman of color, a
Hmm.
visible minority, it's even more important as well. Now, I'm biracial. My dad is Guyanese. My mom is German. My mom is white. She burns. She
Yeah.
doesn't tan, blonde hair, green eyes. And I've grown up in this very
Yeah.
unique, world of being a multi-ethnic family. Our family is very culturally
Hmm.
diverse. I grew up in the greater Toronto area the majority of my life. So let's talk about racism first, and then let me talk about gender.
Yeah.
I really believe that if the church is really going to engage the next generation, we need to change. And I just happened to be reading an article yesterday on Rick Warren and just how he's been transitioning his church.
Hmm.
And, many people don't know he's Southern Baptist and, part of the Southern Baptist Convention and a group of churches. And they were one of the first to even ordain women as pastors in their church and caused a huge issue within the Southern Baptist. And there's been this ripple effect. And I think it's one of the issues. I guess I've talked about women first. Let me just talk about this first, I guess. When it comes to
Hmm.
women, my wife and I have conversations all the time, and she's an engineer by trade, came up through, full degree, going into work in the marketplace, and as a woman had a disadvantage. When God called her into ministry, she was had a disadvantage as a white woman, and so when I look at the challenges that visible minority women have in ministry today, it grieves my heart because it's like the church knows that there's an issue and there's a problem, but we're not willing to change. And when I say we, we're part of the church. I'm not pointing fingers.
Hmm.
We're not willing to change, even know that we have a problem that we have to address and deal with. And so we don't talk about it,
Hmm.
or if we talk about it, it's in more of private, smaller circles. We don't address the elephant in the room. And it's sort of like racism as well. We know that there's an issue of
Hmm.
racism and discrimination in the church, but yet we don't talk about it. And when George Floyd, let me go back just a little bit, and I'm not trying to get
Hmm.
political here in any way, shape, or form, but I really believe that the murder of George Floyd was a turning point in culture. It was a turning point
Hmm.
in young people in
Yeah.
our churches, in our faith communities calling for justice. And the fact that, in my opinion, the church as a whole in Canada was very silent on the issue. I know what I had to deal with in my own church with our young people, and I'm involved here in Brampton with our Brampton Youth and Young Adult Network, and talking to pastors across the city. I literally, Melinda, had a couple youth pastors in our city tell me that their pastor told them that if they addressed the issue, even though the entire youth group was multi ethnic, mostly visible minority, was told by their pastor that if they talk about this issue, they will be fired. And so they were silenced on an issue that young people wanted to
Oh.
talk about. And I realized, Melinda, in that
Mm.
moment, I just felt passionate. I actually posted a couple videos on Facebook. The first one was, "It's okay to say black." The fact that we weren't saying that, we love the black community. We are concerned about the black community. We
Hmm.
we believe that Black Lives Matter and I'm not talking or
Hmm.
referencing the organization. I'm referencing the black community in Canada specifically and in North America, that we love the black community, that this grieves our heart. The fact that the church couldn't even say that grieved me. I have my sister-in-law is black, my nephews, I got cousins. So for me, I'm hearing this dialogue within family, within the church,
Hmm.
within our communities. And here is the church, we're staying silent. I went to one pastor and I said, "How come you're not saying anything about this?" And they said, "Well, we don't want to stir trouble." I said, "The fact that that you're not saying anything when you're leading a 80-90% of your congregation being visible minority means
Hmm.
that says to them that you don't care about the issue." And so And this is my theological argument on this, Melinda. In
Sure.
in Matthew chapter 15, Mark chapter 7, they correlate together.
Mm.
Jesus starts off this passage in this argument with Pharisees and religious leaders over inner purity. And so he's having this argument. The Pharisees come to Jesus and say, "How come your disciples don't wash their hands before they eat?" And so Jesus gives them this whole lecture about what purity and inner purity is. And in verse 12, the disciples say to Jesus, "Jesus, do you know that you offended them?" And Jesus is pretty much like, "Yeah, I've offended them." And Jesus goes on this dialogue. Well, we jump a little further down into that passage. Jesus leaves the area of Galilee and goes to a Gentile area, Tyre and Sidon. From the area of Galilee to Tyre and Sidon is about 60-kilometer walk. Tyre, another 25 kilometers to Sidon. And so here we have Jesus taking his disciples, going to a Gentile area, and Jesus encounters this woman, this Syrophoenician woman, whose daughter is demon possessed. Number one, we know that Jewish men don't speak to women. Number one, right? Unless there's a significant male from their family there, but a Gentile woman. And
Hmm.
Jesus engages this woman in this dialogue. And I don't have time to really get into this, but in the end, because of
Hmm.
her faith, Jesus heals her daughter. But if we really looked into the cultural aspects of that passage, Jesus crosses religious, ethnic, and culture and gender lines. And
Hmm.
so here we go from this argument with Pharisees over inner purity, and Jesus takes his disciples on a 60 to 85-kilometer walk. And we don't have all the details in this, and I'm not meaning to preach here, but I think this
Hmm.
helps shape some things of what we need to deal with here today in the church. Jesus was leading by example to show his disciples whose lives are in danger every moment they walk with Jesus, especially into a Gentile
Hmm.
area. And here, we don't, can you just imagine, Melinda, what the disciples are thinking? They're on this 60-kilometer journey thinking, where are we going? Oh, we're going to Tyre and Sidon. What do you talk about? Jews and Gentiles don't even mix. And then all this other dialogue begins to happen. And so I really believe that Jesus was demonstrating absolutely something crucial the church needs to learn today. Sometimes we have to get into a mess in order to begin to sift through the mess and bring clarity of how we are to
Hmm.
live as believers and our leading voice as the church. So from the area of racism as the church, we need to speak up on these issues. We need to address and say, "Hey, yes, we have allowed a disadvantage and a discrimination towards women in ministry and visible minority women in ministry, and we need to create a platform." And one of the reasons why I started this Instagram conversation space called the Culture Changers,
Hmm.
because I wanted to create space, especially for Gen Z and millennials, to talk about issues that matter to them, because we're not talking about it in the church. Let me just say
Yeah.
this.
And
And go ahead, Melinda. Yeah.
no, I was just gonna say, and Jason, if we don't, then we're losing whole generations, because they'll look at the church and go, "You're not talking about issues that matter to us. You're not giving us and leading in these spaces. You're not demonstrating it yourself, your lives as we watch you. You're not doing it. So why should we follow? Why should we go?" Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel that. I feel like if we don't, here I am as a Gen Xer. If we don't, then we're gonna lose generations, because they're gonna look at church and go,
Yeah.
like, we're not seeing love, we're not seeing conversation, we're not getting into the mess, we're not loving our neighbor, we're not listening to our neighbor, we're afraid, we're pushing back, we're isolating, we're becoming insular, and that's not the church. And like I
No.
said, if I was them and I was looking at the church, I'd be like, I can find another community that is inclusive, that is empowering, that is brave, that is courageous, that is working to love our neighbor outside of the church. And maybe
Yes.
that's part of it. I've been seeing people that, I mean, in one way, deconstructing, and I think that's good, deconstructing out of the church to find healthy communities where they can love their neighbor in that space, which is what I've always thought, oh, the church should be doing. But on the other side, if the church isn't doing it, then God will continue to work with other people and communities and means to do the work of His to love neighbors, right? Like, if the church
Absolutely.
isn't going to do it, then there will be other places that where God is, where God's people can be to do it. And I'm not dissing the church. I think it's a call out to say this should be the place, but if not, his people and God will continue to do it. And anyway, I say that because I'm feeling it, and I'm like, oh, church, because I love the church. I mean, I was on the board of a very large mega church for 8 years, and
Hmm.
they gave me my first like leadership and voice as a woman because my other church couldn't. And so
Yeah.
there was a move for me to go to this other church. So I love it. And I'm a missionary kid. And so church was beautiful and a lifeline for us when we were living in Asia, in the Philippines and Singapore. And
Hmm.
so I love the church. I'm
Yeah.
saddened and grieved by the church, though, Jason, today. And when I say church, there are definitely churches that are life giving and are community based and loving their neighbor. But overall, I just grieve with the things I'm seeing. Anyway, that's me. Go ahead. I know I interrupted you, but I just felt like God will continue to do his work,
Yeah.
right?
Yes, he
Like,
will. Yeah.
so anyway, I
Yeah.
wanted you to finish what you're saying because I think because that's important about racism and gender. Um, and if we don't get in, I love that if we don't get into the mess, like it's like we can't be silent.
No, and Jesus constantly was getting into the mess and really messing with people's minds. When we look at the
No.
cultural, the gender,
Yeah.
the ethnic, the political spectrum, and I'm not saying that
Mm,
that we can't be involved in that, but Jesus really was laying a foundation of, hey, in all this chaos, in all this social unrest, in all this mess, as a rabbi and as a leader, I'm going to lead these young disciples. I'm going to lead by example, and I'm going to lead in word and in deed, and I'm going to show you how to love
mm,
people. And so that whole passage of Matthew chapter 15 earlier is about inner purity, and now Jesus is leading in what Jesus was trying to paint the picture to his disciples and everyone listening around was that you see her vile, reckless, dirty, worth nothing, like the scum of the earth. I see her as a valued member of my
mm,
family, the community, the
mm,
church family. Yeah, I'm just using some common language and terms
yeah.
now. You see her as nothing. I see her as everything. She's a part of this family. So I think what we need to do in order to really engage the next generation is we've got to help young people. We know we're living in the most illiterate generation. Feed, which is an organization in the US, did a study in 2020. 75% of Gen Z reads their Bible one time or less per month. Globally, out of 20 countries, 92%. So we've got to help connect the dots to help young people understand that Jesus cared about these issues. Jesus cared about gender, these gender lines, these ethnic barrier lines, these cultural issues, and we need to look at how Jesus engaged it and bring it back so we have a good theological and biblical foundation so that they go, "Oh man, I might deconstruct the institution of the church and the way that the church does things, but Jesus was totally all in for justice and righteousness." Actually, in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 8 and 9, just to just share this one quick passage before I pass it back to
Mm-hmm.
you, Melinda, is in verse 8 and 9, it talks about speaking up for injustice. And I'm going to just read the message here just quickly. It says, "Speak up
Mm-hmm.
for people who have no voice, for the rights of all the misfits. Speak out for justice. Stand up for the poor and destitute." That's the message version. So here we go right into, just before we go into the virtuous woman, we have these verses squeezed in, and I don't have time to break it down and draw the thread, but we have a responsibility to speak up, to speak out, and to ensure that people get justice. And as the church, whether it's gender or whether it's race or any other issue, we need to make sure that we are a leading voice to engage the next generation. So because I believe this is dear to the heart of God.
Wow. Jason. Fantastic. And I think that goes for everything. I think as followers of Jesus, it's the check every time. Like, is this loving to my neighbor? When I
Hmm.
say this, when I write this on social, when I engage in like brutal conversations on social publicly, is this loving? Is it kind?
Hmm.
I think that, I mean, and again, people are coming to me saying, oh, the polarization, the divisiveness. It's like, well, if we stepped back and we thought, how are we going to be loving? We may
Yeah.
agree to disagree, but how are we going to be loving? But I also agree. I said, for next generation, I'm glad you have a heart for them. I'm glad that, you're speaking up and being with young people. Because I mean, if we don't, then they're going to be learning and watching from other places and other people and other influencers.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I think, in a way, my journey for my own life, though challenging and hard, people have asked me, would you have changed it? Would you? And I said, no, because
Hmm.
through the pain and challenge, I'm who I am today.
Yeah.
Through the pain and process is where I leaned in more to Jesus and was dependent on him more and learned a lot more about myself. And like what you said earlier about how where God put a finger on some things in your life where you saw brokenness and then through, pandemic there was healing. I think that was the same for me in this. And so, you know, um, here's the thing though, even though through it, even though there was racism and biases that I experienced and gender, definitely gender issues with me, I I I can say that God never left me, right?
Yeah.
Like there was always that place where I was hurt and excluded, and yet there is never a time where I did not know and believe and feel that he was with me. And
That's
then I
good.
think that's it, right? Like there was silence. There were times I'm like, God, speak to me right on the wall. Do
Yeah.
something. And there'd be silence and I go, all right, I think you just want me to be quiet and listen. All right, fair.
Wow.
And maybe in the silence it's like, Mel, you need to trust and hope, all those things. So I appreciate that. And I'm glad that in your deconstruction, you're here where you're at. I think it's really important and you're so much about helping the church be a leading voice against injustice, to impact culture with the love of Jesus, and engaging the next generation. Like, Jason, thank you. Honestly, thank you for the work that you're doing. It's so important. I wish there was more people like you that would be, brave enough to stand in that place. Coming back to that group of people whose pastor said not to talk about these issues, what happened? What happened?
They
Did some of them speak up, or did some of them not?
they resigned in a short period of time and left. And so
Really?
yeah, they just felt that being muzzled and silenced was a disservice to the church, to the disservice to them. One of the pastors was black, and one of the other pastors was white, and so the fact that here's this white youth pastor with a highly visible minority youth group who students are hurting. And Melinda, let me say this: I've been on Zoom calls through the pandemic with parents in our church, grown men weeping and saying we're so broken and we
Mm,
just don't know how to process this. And yet, as a pastor, these pastors were not allowed to care for their students in the way that they needed to be cared for, pastored, and discipled, and through the process. And so, you know, they moved on to a place that would give them the freedom and the ability to truly pastor and care for people in the way that they needed. It was a shame.
mm, yeah. Jason, I could speak with you for like 5 hours. You're gonna have to come back because we didn't even go into my second part, and I'll save that because I think that's a whole other conversation that I'd love to have with you,
Sure.
uh, to share about the whole process of that for us. But let's do
Yeah.
this. Can you leave with some final encouragement to the pastor and the leader that is feeling all the things that we've talked about,
Yeah.
leading through all of this and feeling like they're done. They just want to resign and get the heck out of ministry or leadership
Yeah.
and go on a fishing boat out east and you know, you know, get lobster and crab and then eat scallops and Digby. You know what I'm saying? Like just, like that's what we want to do. This is too much. Well,
Yeah.
maybe let's end with that kind of encouragement because I think our viewers and listeners would really appreciate that today.
If I could say anything to pastors and leaders that are out there, I know there are many pastors who have felt through the pandemic that there was nothing that you could do right. Nothing you can do right on the issue of racism or discrimination, vaccines, and political conversations, and all those things, and feeling caught. I want you to know that you are called. You are called. And so many times when we go through such turmoil, it's easy to question, am I called to this? And I just want to encourage you, you know, remember that, or try to remember the day that you felt called into ministry. Number one. Number two, you're not alone. I remember when Elijah had his big battle with, the prophets of Baal, and after such a great victory, went back and was so discouraged and despondent. And he said, God, I feel like I'm the only one. And, God pretty much encouraged him, said, look, there's many more than just you. And I think pastors need to know that they're not the only ones that are, you're not the only one that is going through it. Don't believe the lie of the enemy that it's just you and you won't make it. There are others. And so feeling alone is something I think in ministry, and Melinda, you know what this is like, feeling alone in ministry. You're not alone. And there's great people like Melinda and Crossroads and other phenomenal organizations across the country, and even ministerial networks that really want to care. But sometimes being vulnerable as a pastor is hard because we believe the lie that it makes us weak when we begin to share our hurt and our pain and what we're going through. So I just want to encourage, thirdly, pastors, don't be afraid to share your story. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. I believe vulnerability and being open and honest will bring healing. And I really believe that it dispels the lies of the enemy from making you feel like you're all alone. I believe there's freedom in sharing. And I'm not trying to mess or try to draw the scripture out, but in James it says, confess your sins to one another so you may be healed. I believe that there's healing when we share and we link arms together. So that would be the third thing. And then, the fourth thing, would be, Melinda, I know that you have a heart for pastors and for leaders. I'm sure with your circle of network that you have a relationship, if a pastor reached out to you and said, hey, or DM'd or messaged See Hear and Love and said, hey, I'm hurting, I'm broken, I don't know what to do, I'm all alone, I know that you would direct him in the right place. So I would just say, you're not alone. We're here for you. I know See Hear and Love and Melinda and her team. Myself, reach out to me if you're hurting and you're broken. I love pastors. I love ministry. I love the church. And I believe we need to love each other. We need to lift each other's arms, support each other. And so those are just a few things that I would say. I'm trying not to be overly too spiritual and say, well, pray and read your word, because many of them are doing that already. But I think it's the support systems that are out there, and even get a counselor if you need to. Let me just say this one thing, Melinda. When I was in New Brunswick, my pastor, the church I'm in now, said, Jason, if you don't go to professional counseling out there, you'll never make it back into ministry in any capacity. And I took a chance. It took me 4 months to accept the mentality that I wasn't crazy, because people think, oh, if I go to counseling, professional counseling, then it means I'm crazy. It was the best thing I ever did, Melinda. I became close to my counselor. I did months of therapy and counseling. I just needed an objective
Mm-hmm.
outside perspective of someone that could just help me see what I was going through from a different angle. So just some words. And so pastors, we leaders, we
Mm-hmm.
need to know that we love you. You are important to God and you are important to us.
Jason Persaud, thank you so much. And just to encourage you, keep going. We will pray here at See Her Love that you continue to be brave and
Okay.
courageous as you speak and as you lead, as you encourage pastors and lead youth. We're cheering you on. I so appreciated your
Thank
honesty
you.
in this. There's so much more that we could talk about. So, like I said, you have to come back. But I'm
Thank
grateful
you.
for you and continue to be a voice, even though there's opposition, and there will be, and there always has been with me and you. Keep pressing and leaning in. This is the call that God has on you, as you said. And
Yes.
so thankful for you in this time and space as you lead and you influence. So thank you so much for being with me.
Thanks, Melinda. It's been an honor and privilege. Love this conversation and would love to come back sometime and pick up part two sometime. It'd be great. Love you and,
All right.
and appreciate you so
Okay.
much.